it's hard to imagine that these barren wildernesses were once populated by people whose only source of fuel was peat, the very ground on which they stood. Peat extraction became a successful industry during the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was during this period that the mass excavation of northern European bog bodies took place. One can imagine the shock of the peat diggers going about their work on unearthing the remains of a human body. But imagine unearthing two bodies. The Weerdinga couple were found lying side by side on their backs, one body with its arm under the other. The human shape is hard to detect because of the pressure of the soil over time and little remains of the heads.
Well, what we got here is a pair of bog bodies, and this is a quite unique find because you rarely find bog bodies in pairs. So it's very special. And one thing which is very special also is that they lie in a position which is very carefully laid down. So you can quite clearly see here the hand of one bog body and his arm stretching out underneath the other one, giving the impression that it was carefully laid down. So it's really that they, you can say that they have been put there deliberately. It's not that they had an accident or so, they drowned in the peat or whatever. They have been put in this position.
When they were first discovered in 1904, it was assumed because they were found in embrace that they were married or lovers, and they were given the nicknames Mr. and Mrs. Vanderpeet, the supposed husband's arm being in a gesture of protection or affection. But recent analysis has overturned that theory.
And it was only discovered in 1990 that on the basis of the stubbles on the chin of this bug body, that they found out that this was also a male, and it was recently confirmed by the DNA analysis.
But why would these two men be buried together in this contrived position? They could have been brothers in arms, warriors who were ambushed by an enemy, killed and buried in the bog. Unless this was a punishment for what the ancients might deem shameful behavior. Roman commentator Tacitus comments on the treatment of criminals during the Iron Age, which would fit in with the fate of the Weerdinga men.
The punishment varies to suit the crime. The traitor and deserter are hanged on trees. The coward, the shirker, and the disreputable of body are drowned in miry swamps under a cover of wattle hurdles. The distinction in the punishments implies that deeds of violence should be paid for in the full glare of publicity, but the deeds of shame should be suppressed.
Does the remote burial in a bog indicate that the Weerdinga men committed a deed of shame that needed to be suppressed? The embrace again raises the question of their relationship. Perhaps they were homosexual lovers, and homosexuality was considered shameful by some tribes in this part of Northern Europe.
Among the German tribes, homosexuality was considered to be very shocking, a kind of transgression of moral laws, and would have been severely punished.
But the real relationship between the Weerdinga men is still a matter for conjecture.
We do not have any indication that they were lovers, but it might have been, but it might just as well have been father and son, might have been two brothers, just two friends, having no sexual relation whatsoever. We don't know anything about that.
One further piece of evidence, however, suggests strongly that there was a ritual element to the death of the Weerdinga men. The man on the right has been stabbed in the abdomen. These are his entrails that have emerged from the wound.
And you can see here in this region there is a real cut and all the intestines coming out, so they must have been stabbed in some sort of a way. But we really think that it was killed deliberately and that it was a sort of ritual killing before putting them in the bog.
We know from classical writers that the Druids used entrails to predict the future. And it may very well be that this particular unfortunate person was used as a kind of predictor of the future.
What's a puzzle is the reason for the double sacrifice and the relationship between these two men. Brothers, soldiers, lovers, their story remains a mystery. Another Iron Age mystery, alongside the Werdinger couple at the Landers Museum in Hanover, is this haunting tortured frame, Red Franz. So called because of his striking red hair, was found in 1900 on a raised bog in Bortangermoor, an area between Holland and Germany. There was nothing to explain the cause of his death. Nothing until the body was turned over from the face-down position he had been found in. His throat had been cut.
We can't know whether Red Franz was sacrificed or not, but we think maybe there was something special about his death.
Sacrifice or murder? Unlike other clear-cut cases, Red Franz displayed no immediate signs of ritual killing. Forensic analysis revealed a bending of this upper leg bone, indicating that he had spent much time on horseback. Perhaps he was a warrior killed in combat. His collarbone had been broken, and he had been shot by an arrow, but both injuries had healed during his lifetime and have nothing to do with his death. The position of his arms indicates a typical reflex if the throat was being cut. It seems that unlike most bog bodies of the Iron Age, Red Franz may not have been sacrificed, but murdered.
He was a horseman. That means that he was somebody who was really probably quite important, because owning a horse means that you can afford a horse. And he may have been a sacrificial killing because he was of such high status, but we mustn't rule out the fact that he may just have been some kind of criminal, transgressed the rules of his community and paid the ultimate price.
Schleswig, a picturesque town in northern Germany with its lofty spires and quaint houses, lies on a watery river inlet. The Grand City Museum is now home to the Windaby Girl, who Miranda Green has come to see for the first time as part of her ongoing research. Peat cutters discovered this amazing bog body in 1952 on a country estate just outside the town.
Gosh, she looks very young, just lying there. Looks about 12, and she looks so peaceful, and yet it's almost certain that she led to a rather dreadful death. By drowning, she must have been terrified.
A high proportion of Iron Age sacrifices were pubescent girls like Windaby here.
She was perhaps an adolescent on the verge of womanhood, not quite woman, not quite child, and maybe that was the reason why she was chosen for sacrifice at that time, because that kind of person is very powerful. She's virginal, and that gives her power. She's on the threshold of womanhood, so that kind of double state may have given her a special significance and may indeed account for her death.
Miranda is convinced that the blindfold found around the Windaby girl's eyes is further evidence of this special significance within the community.
I like to think that maybe she was some kind of seer, a soothsayer, a shaman perhaps, who had a blindfold to symbolize her ability for second sight.
The Windaby girl then may have been singled out to act as a messenger to the gods, precisely because she had the power of second sight. And there is further evidence to back up this theory.
She has a birch staff in her hand, which may have meant that she had some kind of authority in some way. And we can point to numerous anthropological parallels of people, adolescent girls particularly, who were chosen to be the priestesses of their communities.
One peculiar feature of this burial is that the Windaby girl's head had been half shaved before she died. This would tie in with the theory that, contrary to the idea that she was a highly honored priestess, the Windaby girl was killed as a punishment for playing around with someone else's husband. Archaeologists became excited when soon after the discovery of the Windaby girl's body on a country estate in northern Germany, a second body was found very close by, that of an older man. Little was preserved except his skin, but modern tongues began to wag. Could he have been the girl's adulterous lover? And was this the reason for her shaved hair?
The shaved hair seemed to show in the direction of a sexual crime. And maybe they had a love affair with each other, maybe even adultery. And that might have been the reason why she might have been killed and buried in the bog.
For 50 years, archaeologists interpreted the burial of these two bodies in such close proximity as punishment for their illicit affair.
But this spring we got radiocarbon dates which show that the girl was buried anyhow in the middle of the 1st century AD and the man the 3rd century BC. So the love story is gone. There's nothing. This couldn't be possible.
So our fertile modern imaginations that had concocted a great love story had to accept that this was no Iron Age seduction.
From my point of view, I think she didn't seduce anyone in the Iron Age. It's not needed, this hypothesis. I think she seduced some archaeologists in the 20th century.
Miranda remains convinced that the Windaby girl was a special person, a shaman, the ultimate gift from her community to the gods.
It could be that because she was an important person in the community, she was sacrificed to be the ultimate sacrifice, if you like, to make sure that the gods listened.
The whole community would have gathered to the gods, a precious gift of their priestess. The girl may have been led out to the bog accompanied by chanting, singing, and drumming.
And then perhaps the whole village would accompany her to the edge of the bog. We can imagine her feeling of complete horror, and then somebody would be chosen to lead her out into the marsh. And then she was laid down, she was drowned.
Her tranquil figure today tells us much about the violence of her premature death at the hands of her community. But there are other bog bodies from other times with very different stories to tell. Ireland, the Emerald Isle, boasts a beautiful and unspoiled countryside, which is wild and remote. Its vibrant capital, Dublin, has lovely shopping streets and grand buildings such as the National Museum of Ireland, which contains much of the country's Celtic heritage and some of its bog bodies. This ghoulish figure is the Minnie Braden girl, Ireland's best preserved bog body. What makes her different from the rest is that radiocarbon dating confirmed that she had lived during the late medieval period, around the 15th or 16th centuries. She was no Iron Age human sacrifice. The question of why she was buried in a lonely bog and not within the consecrated ground of a churchyard remains a mystery. She was found in 1978 by turf cutters working on a lonely bog in County Donegal in the northwest of Ireland. As curator of the National Museum of Ireland, Reinald O'Floyne was soon at the scene to take a look at the body for himself.
When the Minnie Braden bog body was found, I obviously had some idea in my mind before I went up of what these bodies looked like, but nothing prepared me for actually lifting the shroud the first time and looking into the face of this individual, which on the one hand was quite peaceful, but on the other hand was actually quite upsetting in many senses.
The extraordinary state of preservation meant that the scientists were soon able to provide a clear profile of the woman at the time of her death. She was aged between 25 and 35. Her teeth were in a good state, and she was well nourished. The Minnie Braden girl had led a reasonable, comfortable life. The cause of death and the reason for burial in the bog remained a mystery until examinations of X-rays and CAT scans provided a clue. Although there was no evidence of burning on the skin, there were traces of carbon on the lungs, which indicated that she lived in a smoky atmosphere.
It is consistent with the way of life that most people in that area would have lived. They would have lived in smoky houses because the smoke didn't get away up a chimney.
The smoke may have given rise to an infection that was to kill the Minnie Braden girl.
She had only really one indication of a possible inflammation during her life, and that was a possibility of having had pleurisy. And there are many, many conditions that can give rise to pleurisy. I imagine the most common in those days would have been a simple pneumonia.
So pneumonia may have killed her, but that doesn't explain her burial in the bog. Most of the bog bodies found in Ireland from the medieval period were people who had lost their way, stumbled and drowned in the bog. The Minnie Braden girl was different.
In this case, this was a deliberate burial. The body was carefully wrapped and then placed at a depth of about 3 feet from the surface. So there was a certain amount of care and attention taken in the burial.
But this wasn't a normal Christian burial with the body oriented east-west. And there certainly must have been a reason for her burial outside the consecrated ground of a churchyard. She may have been a stranger from outside the community or a murder victim. We know from x-rays that she wasn't pregnant, so she hadn't died in childbirth. Reinald O'Floyne thinks there could be a medical explanation.
It could be that she could be suffering from some form of a disease, some form of plague or something which doesn't manifest itself physically, and therefore required her to be buried in and out of the way location.
It's impossible to paint an accurate picture explaining the death and burial of the Minnie Braden girl, but one thing's for sure. Despite her lonely final resting place, she was loved and respected for by the people who placed her here. Another unusual medieval bog burial is now only in fragments and has a much more sinister story. The Drents Museum in Holland houses a small, severed hand that may have belonged to a victim of witchcraft. It was found with a number of skull fragments which, after forensic analysis, showed that there were 4 people buried at the same site. Curator Vincent van Vilsteren is fascinated by these human remains and wants to find out what happened to these people. Small and delicate, the hand appears to tell a chilling tale.
So all what we've got left here of the 4 bodies is a few bones in these little bags here. But the most intriguing is definitely this little hand. You can see the nails still on it. You can see the bones. It's a very tiny little hand. What is most intriguing maybe is the way this hand is grasping something, grasping the peat, grasping a little bit of life. So we really don't know what happened to these people. We only have these remains, and we want these remains to be studied to get some answers to the questions. Questions like, who were these people? Just what happened to them?
A cross-section of peat gives a clear picture of where these remains belong in the layers of time.
The carbon dating analysis gives us some very interesting results. First of all, it shows us that the hand is not as old as all the other bog bodies in our museum. The hand dates really from the 16th century, let's say this level. But what is most interesting is that the peat that was grasped in the hand is much older. It's from the 9th century, let's say this level. Now that means that the bodies themselves were buried in a pit dug into the peat, and there were branches of alder put on top, so they really have been buried there deliberately.
Was this a case of murder? A multiple murder in a lonely marsh far away from human habitation? What had gone on here? Was this a robbery gone wrong? A punishment? Or something more sinister?
Now the hand and the human remains are only half the story. Found with the bodies are a number of objects that give us some very interesting information.
These coins found with the bodies were minted in the mid to late 16th century, which corroborates the radiocarbon dating of the remains. Their presence rules out the notion that this was a robbery. After all, what thief would leave his loot with his dead victim? But it is the burial under the elder branches and the presence of the large bronze cauldron or kettle that raises the most suspicion of witchcraft. An historian who studied medieval witchcraft in detail and has a theory about the elder branches and the cauldron is Owen Davies.
The burial of these pots and cauldrons is almost certainly, I think, ritual. as a ritual element. The fact that we find them associated with bodies, but also we find them on their own in sort of solitary deposits out in the same sort of areas as the bodies are found, would suggest that this is some sort of offering. And the elder branches on top of these burials could be interpreted from a ritual point of view, the idea of elder having some magical potent property which, if laid over the bodies, would somehow prevent their spirits from being able to emerge.
During the 16th century, magic rituals were forbidden. Holland was a Christian country, and worship of pagan gods was considered sinful. Other pots like this small bronze vessel have been found in other strange burials, but to whom were these offerings of cauldrons or kettles being made?
It might have been to the devil, it might have been to some other spirit, it might have been to the mysterious maidens of the mist. We really don't know. Perhaps, like this pot, the kettle that was found near the hand was also put there as part of a superstitious ritual.
This was a time when pagan religions were being pushed out by Christianity, but occasionally the boundaries overlapped.
All sorts of magical rituals were taking place under the sort of tacit acceptance of the church, and you do get cases of priests who are actually professional magicians at the same time, who are actually offering these sort of services.
These people could have been outsiders, socially unacceptable, perhaps suicides, murderers or rapists, given a Christian burial, but dealt with again in a secret magical ritual because of the fears of their evil spirits.
They would have been dug up again rather like a vampire and removed from consecrated ground and then pinned down, and in various other sort of physical and magical ways prevented from returning to the grave.
If these 4 people had died of natural causes, they would have been left in peace in the local church cemetery. Vincent van Vilsteren, therefore, only has one conclusion to make.
Now this is the actual spot where the bog bodies have been found. And as you can see, it's really in the middle of nowhere. And you have to imagine that in 1901, this whole area was covered with peat. If they would have died of some disease or natural cause, they would normally have been buried in a coffin on the cemetery of Bijlen, which is the nearest village over there. So taking all the evidence into account, I really think that these young people may well have been the victim of some superstitious ritual or witchcraft.
A superstitious ritual to rid the community once and for all of the evil spirits of 4 wrongdoers who may have returned as the living dead. Evidence given up to us by the bogs of Northern Europe confirms that the practice of human sacrifice was widespread during the Celtic Iron Age in Germany, Denmark, Britain, and Ireland. The Gaelic man discovered in Ireland is believed to have lived between 470 BC and 120 BC. He is now a prized exhibit of the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. Spooky, but fascinating to look at. The deliberate positioning of his body and articles found with the corpse suggests that he hadn't simply fallen into the bog and drowned, but that he was a victim of human sacrifice. There is no evidence in the burial to suggest a violent struggle. The Gaelic man may have been a willing sacrifice, or he was given something to make him drowsy enough not to be aware of what was happening to him as he was killed.
It's highly possible that the individual may have been drugged beforehand, because there is no evidence of violence, there is no evidence of a struggle. The way that the body was finally placed in the bog would suggest a peaceful method of death.
Artifacts found with the Gaelic man may strengthen the argument that this was sacrifice. The neck fastening of his deerskin cape may have been used to strangle him, a typical method of sacrificial killing. 2 stout poles about 6 feet long placed close to the body are further evidence that we are dealing with human sacrifice and may give us a clearer idea of why this person was chosen.
What we would have here is a social outcast, perhaps of some kind, and that this person was being banished to this other world, if you like. And then the interpretation of the stakes may be, as has been suggested elsewhere, that they were used to pin the body both physically and perhaps metaphorically to this other world, to prevent the spirit from coming back to haunt the living.
The circumstances of his death remain a mystery, but he must have been somebody special.
He was clearly somebody of quite some status within his community. He might even have been a foreigner, he could have been a hostage, but he was clearly somebody who was of significant status and treated like that in death as well as in life.
Professor Miranda Green's pilgrimage to the Iron Age bog bodies of Northern Europe ends in Denmark, where she meets with Danish archaeologist Lone Vass to share theories on the death of the Gunhild's bog woman. She has come to St. Nicholas Church in the Danish town of Vejle. Here she will meet face to face a woman who was killed more than 2,000 years ago.
Gosh, I didn't know what to expect. This is unbelievable. It really is just so mind-bending just to see her like this. Oh, I would love to have met her, you know. What a story she could tell. Amazing.
X-rays show that the first two vertebrae had been broken, a sure sign of strangulation. Close examination of the skin around the neck by pathologist Dr. Mark Hill Gregerson corroborates the strangulation theory.
We saw at the front of the neck a horizontal groove, and when we looked carefully we saw a similar groove on the left side of the neck, and there was also one at the back of the neck. My conclusion is that it most probably is a homicide, but I can't tell you why they did the homicide.
No one can really say why this homicide was carried out. What we do know from the study of other bog bodies is that it's almost certainly a case of human sacrifice at a time of crisis in a fragile ancient community. But why was she hammered into the bog by stakes at her arms and legs?
I think it goes back to this idea of she being a sacred gift and the bog being sacred as well. So again, she needed to be placed in it. She couldn't float away from the spot where she needed to be. And she needed to be, in a sense, embedded within the great heart of the marsh. And the only way to guarantee doing that is to stake her down.
It's likely that these ancient peoples actually knew that the bogs would preserve these human sacrifices, and they would be places of pilgrimage and worship where they'd witness the magical preservation of their sacrifice for generations to come.
It may well be that people were quite well aware of the preservative qualities of bogs and marshes. And maybe because of that, these places became known as special places, centres of pilgrimage where people came perhaps year in, year out because the area was considered to be sacred. So in a sense, yes, she was dying, but in a way she wasn't, because she was going to survive. She wasn't going to decay like other bodies. So she was going to stay with the community.
Ancestors who speak to us across the centuries are precious reminders of lives long gone. Our journey across the bogs of Northern Europe and into the wilds of America's Florida has given us a fascinating glimpse into the culture and practices of ancient peoples. Many of the bog people died violently, but their deaths, though deliberate, were to these peoples for good reason. Many were considered honorable, chosen to answer the needs of their people, and they should be given due reverence still today.